Yo, what's up, y'all? Today we have a cool podcast with CEO of Ellipsis Drive, Rosalie Maas, and she's calling in from the Netherlands. We have a fun conversation just about what running a company is like in Europe, about what it's like running a business, basically with her brother and another co-founder of hers. And we get into her customers, how she deals with investors, how she scaled the team. Very interesting conversation with a fantastic CEO. Learned a lot, and confident you guys will too. All right, see you guys on the other side. There's a big kickboxing tradition in the Netherlands. Is that how you view it?
No, definitely not. I lived abroad for a while, and as you do, you get the chance to sort of get to know your own culture, because sometimes people feel like they don't have one, quote unquote. It's not true at all. It's usually when you're outside of your own context, you start to notice that the culture is usually like very, very much ingrained into who you are and who you are as a nation. In general, I look at the Netherlands and I see like a small country with way too many people having like nitty gritty rules for everything, but that do manage to live together very nicely regardless. So it's like, you know, with the Norwegians and the Swedes that are like sort of historically known for being Vikings, but are now just all goody two shoes. I think the Netherlands is somewhat similar.
That's an insane marketing coup by the Nordic peoples. Like, how did they like rebrand themselves as Vikings? I feel like that's a recent thing, right? In the last 30 years. I don't know if like 2 generations ago, people thought of them as Vikings. I mean, I don't know. What's your impression of that?
I think it's Hollywood that just projected that onto them. Like I know that like whenever you visit Denmark or Norway, you'll stumble across like a Viking museum within 5 minutes of exiting the airport. So it's very much like, you know, ingrained into their minds. And for the Netherlands, you'll run into museums that, you know, tell the history of, you know, shipping mostly. Yeah. Well, there's been a lot of, you know, like colonizing back in the like what we used to call the golden age, like in the 1900s. So it's just part of history. You stumble on it as soon as you enter a country.
Yeah, I mean, every dominant civilization and culture colonizes. I mean, that's a human tradition, right? You want to expand the empire. I mean, okay, so are the Netherlands people are seafaring people? I mean, you mentioned sailing. Mm-hmm. And a tradition of shipping. Is that the case? I didn't put 2 and 2 together there.
Yeah, very much so. It's definitely a seafaring country. Like if you look at history, you sort of see that, you know, in terms of colonization, and I like it's part of history, so you might as well talk about it. But in terms of colonization, you see that you know the Spanish used to be first. They sailed to the Indies and started like creating colonies there. Then the Dutch basically took over because we were very pragmatic. Like the Spanish wanted to take these lands by force. And the Dutch were like, well, you know, just do whatever as long as you trade with us. And that was like, you know, a better way of going about it. And then the British came and they again overtook the Netherlands, or the Dutch more like, because the Netherlands didn't really exist in the 16th century. It was more of like, you know, city states and the like. And then the Netherlands or the Dutch basically held on to Indonesia and a number of their colonies for a good while, and then actually way too long. So that's sort of the history of it. But yeah, definitely a lot of seafaring going on. You know, it ages, or it goes back to like the age where Dutch painters are known for, like Rembrandt and Van Gogh. They're all from that same you know 16th century, 17th century era.
Is the Dutch national identity strong? Like, is there a strong sort of like Dutch identity, or do people identify as mostly European?
Good question. I feel like if you ask Dutch people on the street, they'll find that they don't have a strong identity. But as I mentioned before, like as soon as you move outside of your own country, you notice that you very much do. So I think it's more ignorance and some level of not really reflecting on who you are and how you relate to the people around you. I definitely do know that looking at yourself as a European is a Dutch thing. So people always consider themselves Dutch and European or an EU citizen. As a small country, yeah, it is very important to have those like international relationships, and we're very much Europe focused.
Yeah, no, I mean it's a really like strong point because I remember I used to live in China. I lived in China for like a couple of years, and coming back from China, I felt more American because like when I lived there, I realized like how much of the other I was, and how foreign just the culture was to me personally. Yeah, that's interesting. I think travel does like it just creates like a nice contrast.
I think it's funny because I've lived in the US for a while. I have American colleagues and I have a bunch of American friends. And for them, it's a very common thing to say, like, yeah, America, we lack a culture. Like there's a bit of everything, but we don't really have an American culture. And it's like, that's so not true. The American culture is so strong,
Yep.
and it may not have like centuries of history behind it, or millennia of history, I should say, because it definitely has centuries of history behind it. But like it is very strong, and it's very visible to anyone who's been out of that context for a while. But it's also a privilege to get to be out of that context. So it's not me judging; it's just observing. I think it's funny.
No, it is true. Why do you think Americans do that?
I think actually one of the reasons that I think that happens is because there is a strong, history of migration. So there's always this feel of like, yeah, where are my roots? Where did I originally come from? What's my migration background? That makes people curious, and that makes them start to dig in and see, well, where they came from and who their people are. And that may also make them long for something that is like this consumable bit of culture, based on where their family hails from, and that may also make them feel like they don't currently have one. Whilst that's not true at all. And like the funny thing is that I don't even know the name of my great grandfather. I have no clue where my family is from, but I've never had this sort of identity crisis that I wonder, like, yeah, where am I from? It's like, doesn't really matter, does it? But if your country has such a strong migration history in which this narrative is very much carried by current populations and still the migration stories that are going on, I feel it's much more present, and you may sort of long for something that you think you're missing, whilst you're actually not really missing it. But it's again a perception thing.
The US is a country that's like built on immigration, and it's interesting. Like in the early days, you could trace like all the English folks, they stayed in, I guess, what's now called New England. And then all the Scots Irish went down to the south of the US where we're headquartered. And you see it in the sort of whiskey making tradition down here, right? Which is just interesting. So yeah, it's also wild being like a first generation non-Anglo immigrant and still considering yourself American. That I think maybe not so much, but has been like a uniquely American thing, maybe for 50 years or so. So cool. Okay. Let's get to business, because I want to know about your company and maybe a little bit about yourself for the audience. The audience is mostly technical.
Yeah. So then I'm going to start off disappointing, because I'm actually the least technical person out of our group of co-founders. I'm the CEO, and as such, the least technical person there. So apologies for that. But luckily I have two co-founders.
No, it's all good.
And I'll talk about them for a bit as well. But my own academic background is actually within environmental sciences and earth sciences. I set out to basically try and understand system Earth. I was interested in everything from the soil to the waters to the skies, and like the biome that lives in and all in between. But then I realized that in order to understand system Earth, you actually also really need to understand people. We have a huge impact on the Earth, as we all know. So I started to divulge into more social sciences like international politics, innovation studies, international development, etc. And it's been a great eye-opener for me, actually. This was during my master's. And then with that, I felt like, okay, I sort of achieved the goal that I had at the start of my studies to better understand like the world we live in, both the physical part of it and the social part of it. But the moment I actually fell in love with the idea of entrepreneurship was when I lived in Chicago. I worked for the Dutch consulate there, and I was tasked with mapping out the startup ecosystem there, which is pretty great. It's a really good spot to be a startup in. So I needed to map that out, needed to understand it, see how we could build bridges between the US and the Netherlands. And that's where I realized that I didn't want to work for government whatsoever, and will never again. even though, they're all great people, I wanted to be one of those startups. I thought, yeah, this is what I want to do. This is great. But I didn't really do a techie study, did I? So I phoned up my brother, who a mathematical physicist from his academic background, and turned that into, as many other people do, like data science and data engineering skills in his early career. And we also called in an old school friend of ours, Minghai, who's our third co-founder, and he has done computer science and has been working as a developer for a while. So I figured between the three of us, we had like the hipster and the hustler and the hacker, and we had like, what you need for a startup. And we got started basically going through a whole bunch of very bad ideas, and then they became increasingly less bad. And at some point, we were like, yeah, this is good enough. This is something that we can kick off with. So let's incorporate a company and try to make this happen. And that's when we just got started, the three of us, back in 2018 under the name Ellipsis Earth Intelligence, which wasn't Ellipsis Drive, but the name's already in there, so we were somewhat close. And we went from there. But that's how we got started.
Is that a Paul Graham reference? Hipster, hacker, and hustler?
Yeah, it's from somewhere. I definitely didn't make that up myself, but it came to me in the moment.
Yeah, because I feel like I remember reading that in like a essay by the dude who founded Y Combinator. But that's a cool designation.
It's entirely possible that it came from him. Yeah, credit where credit's due.
Yeah, it's cool. I love the framing. So okay, so you're the hustler, I presume.
Yeah.
Is that accurate? Yeah. Okay, nice.
Yes, it is. And I guess between my brother Daniel and Minghai, it's mostly Daniel who's the hipster, and he's basically the thought father of the product that we've built. Like, it primarily came out of his brain, and then Minghai is the hacker, is the guy who actually built it, without whom it would have all just like tumbled like a cart house. So yeah, it's been a ride.
That's cool. Okay, what's the Dutch conception of a hipster? Because we have the Brooklyn hipster. Is that the same, like, in your mind?
I mean, yeah, you've been to Amsterdam, so as soon as you start walking the streets here, it's pretty in your face. The dress, the music that they listen to, the coffee houses that are frequented. But I mean, in startup terms, it's of course mostly about, at least in the way that I understand it, mostly about like being right there on the edge of what's trending, like trend watching, knowing where things are going. And I'm definitely not that hip, but when it comes to technology, we're better at it. Like, we all come to work in our company t-shirts and try not to worry too much about the way we look. But when in the tech industry, we're doing well.
I had a guy once, a long time ago, like, tell me that I needed to wear a suit to be taken seriously. Like, this is in the very early days of the company, and you can see also how I dress. I don't really have suits. And so, yeah, it's interesting. Like, I really do appreciate the performance oriented culture of our industry, where you can kind of just dress for comfort and execute. It's cool.
Yeah.
Cool. Okay. How's it like working with your brother? Leading him, is that?
Yeah, so it's been great, actually. We've been asked this question from very early on. And in the very early days, people always saw it as like a liability. But by now, we've been working together so long that people realize it's actually a very stable thing. And it is. And we knew that when we got started. Like, my brother and I, we differ like 2-3 years in age, but we've basically done like any project in our childhood together. Like, we were very good as kids. So we know that we can rely on each other. We know we're both like smart people, and I know that if I ask him to do something, he'll do whatever. And for me, it's the same. Same goes for Minghai, by the way. Like, he's an incredibly like great teammate, a very reliable guy that I trust with my life. So that makes it easy. And well, in terms of like leading him, we all have our own corner in which we make decisions. Like, I don't make like highly technically oriented decisions. Like, I need to understand, like, why is this being why is this decision being made, or what are our business interests, or what are our commercial interests, and then we talk about it, and then we find out what the best solution is. So there's hardly any like command that overrides someone else's opinion. Like that doesn't make any sense either. We very much consider everyone to have their own space in which they're the most knowledgeable person. So you'll always defer to their opinion in those spaces. And oftentimes there is this interaction that allows you to land on the right answer. And I think seeing as in the early days, but still to a degree right now, my brother and I basically had a joint product management role in which you're like, okay, so which direction should the product develop into? I had the most direct feedback from the market. He's always been directly involved in supporting clients. He obviously knows every in and out of the product, so he knows what's technically possible. He can set some boundaries, like, yeah, no, that this would make it bloated. So there's always like this string we're pulling to the left and to the right, and because there's so much trust, we know that it will end up, in a happy middle. So yeah, no, I wouldn't have it any other way. I'm very thankful that I get to do this with people I inherently trust. So yeah, it's all good, I would say.
That's beautiful. That's beautiful. And so, how do your parents feel about you guys working together? I'm sure they're stoked. Like that's such a cool story for them.
Yeah, they are. They're very proud parents, very supportive parents too. But yeah, no, they quite love it. And when we got started, they, as opposed to investors and then people who were around us, didn't have any doubts that this would go would go well, because they had so much experience with us doing like arts and crafts projects and that kind of stuff when we were kids, that they were perfectly comfortable.
That's sweet. You seem like super knowledgeable about leadership and management. Like, how long have you guys been operating this business? A couple of years?
A little longer, actually. I think we're at about 5 years. But we started out as Ellipsis Earth Intelligence, and we've done that for 2 years. And then we realized that we needed a strong pivot, because the concept that we had at the time like didn't cut it for like a proper, highly scalable startup. So we went to Ellipsis Drive a couple of years in. With almost a different business, really. So yeah, Ellipsis Drive has been around for 3 years.
That's cool. I mean, similar to our story, we started basically as like, we built our whole business on Google Sheets and like, off the shelf SaaS products. And then we basically built our own platform a couple of years in. And so similar story, really. What did you do before starting this company? You mentioned you used to work in government.
Yeah, so I held a couple of jobs. I basically started out, like we founded the company when I was still doing my master's, which was a 2-year program that in the end took me 3 years because I was doing this full time. I was just doing my master's like in the late evening hours and the weekends. But I always liked to work next to my studies. Sorry, what? I always worked next to my studies, so I did the job in government in Chicago for a while. I also organized like live programs and panels and such in this very hipster place in Amsterdam that basically discusses like all sorts of social affairs. I like to focus on tech and big data in society, so those were like the live journalism programs that I built back there. That was a lot of fun. I did that during my bachelor's, and held some other more startup related jobs in the meantime, mostly focusing on building ecosystem and such. But yeah, that's when I realized I didn't want to do the facilitating bit. I very much wanted to do it myself. But yeah, all in all, I'd say that I started the business with, in aggregate, like 2-3 years of work experience. So not that much. Pretty green.
No, that's so cool. Okay, so like, do you have like advisors and mentors and all that? Like, how did you learn? Did you just learn by doing? Like, because I think it's like a non-intuitive position to be like, hey, I'm not going to command and control. I'm going to just let people execute who are experts. Like, it took me a long time to come to that realization. So I'm just curious how you got there so quickly.
When I found out I wanted to start the business, I was about to go into my master. So during that time, we cycled through all those ideas that with time became better and better. At the time, I also just took a bunch of like entrepreneurial classes, which were great because that basically meant that I could build my business while getting credits. And we enrolled ourselves into like the university startup hub and accelerator program, which in some ways those can be kind of lame, but also if I'm honest, they're also very, very helpful. because they give you a lot of tools, and sometimes they're a bit of open doors, but at the same time, sometimes you just need to hear those things and then it sticks somewhere in your head. You get to meet peers, you get to meet mentors, as you mentioned, and you have access to investor networks, which is very valuable because actually every fundraising, every funding round that we did was off the back of closing out some sort of accelerator program. So we got like an early pre-seed round when I was still in university from that accelerator program that we did from a local angel here in the Netherlands. And then when we went through Techstars with the Ellipsis Drive concept, we raised with Promise Ventures. It's a US-based fund that has an office in Luxembourg as well. And that was thanks to like the acceleration and the network and the mentorship that you get there. So that was very helpful. That was like a helpful, a bit of direction. But in the end, it is definitely all about learning by doing, just getting out there and try things, like fail fast, as they say. But it's nice to have like the structure of, a program or the kindness of a peer network that is sort of there with you, even though in the end you got to do it with your own team, and there's no way around it. Like no one's going to put in the work except for you. That's also definitely something I've learned.
Yeah. What have been some lessons that have taught you that?
I think whenever you talk to mentors and board members and advisory board members and investors, and this is not to discredit them, but in the end, like they can give you advice, they can give you intros, they can give you some templates, but in the end, like you have to do the stuff that actually makes mountains move. And that's I think important to realize. Like if you come across an investor that says like, yeah, we're highly active investors and we're going to help you do all sorts of stuff, then I do believe that they think they mean it. But at the end of the day, these things are also just up to the teams themselves. And that's just something you notice. And I notice that as I talk to other founders, they very much recognize this. Like, yeah, there can be an intent to be very active, and to some degree, this can be true. But like, don't ever think that anyone's going to pull as hard to make your business a success than yourself. Like you always need to be in the driver's seat.
That's so true. I always feel like that after an accelerator or like a startup program, or even after like a round, the value has like a J curve. Like it actually drops like during and immediately after, because you just spend all your time raising and talking and now managing these new relationships. And then like a year or two later, you're like, I'm actually really glad I did that, because now we're seeing like yield on the investment. So yeah, it's so true about their viewpoints too and their ability to help. How big is your team now, by the way?
We're with 15 people, plus some people that are like working remotely, spending like part of their week working with us. So it's a good crew of people.
Distributed all over the world, I assume?
We started out that way because we were like basically accelerating our growth during COVID. So I think we started out having like a small, like in-person, like core of the team here in the Netherlands. So with the three co-founders and some very early employees, we're all on site. And then we started hiring pretty remote in that first like year of COVID. But then we definitely did intend for them to slowly move towards the Netherlands as well. And at this point in time, there's actually 12 of us here in the Netherlands. So the majority has become in person as opposed to remote. So it's been sort of an organic movement during COVID. Like at some point, you find yourself with more space to move your person, and you have more commitment from the people that are joining the team. You have more funds. You can move people over. You can arrange for visas, et cetera, et cetera. That's a huge headache, by the way. But in the end, it works out. And then, now we have most of our people like right here.
I think I already know the answer to this question, but I'll ask anyway. What's your take on like a Zoom meeting versus an in-person meeting? What's better for you?
I mean, I think actually the answer very much depends on who you're talking to. Like I found most of my seed investors I haven't met in person ever. And I don't mind it. Like it's fine. Like we are perfectly able to connect for our board meetings over calls. We have Slack. We have WhatsApp. We can call each other. However, when you're working with your team, like internally, we find that you definitely do benefit from an in-person situation because you become more creative with that. Like we currently have like a 50-50 in-office policy. Like everyone likes to be flexible, and a lot of people like working from home. But at the same time, you notice that it's good to have a change of scenery, that it's good to sort of be in office together and let things happen organically. So I do find that important for like our own internal team. Also, those who work remote, they have work that, doesn't quite, like, it doesn't really hurt if you do that remote, but at the same time, we still fly them in to join us for a week or so every once in a while. So for team internal dynamics, I do highly value, face-to-face contact with clients. I love the fact that like COVID was a thing and we can just have calls because it's so much faster. You can just spend a ridiculous amount trying to see people in face to face and find that it's not that useful. The exception being like some industries are so archaic that face to face conversation is important for them. But then you can also like, I don't know, is this then really the space that we should focus on as a startup if it's that much behind? So yeah, with investors, I find it perfectly fine to primarily see people via Zoom, for example, or whatever calling mechanism you use. For the team, I highly value direct conversations in person, also because you can get to know each other, you can have dinner, have fun. And then with clients, I really like that has become commonplace to just work together via Zoom or whatever. Much more time efficient.
What's more taxing for you, like a full day of in-person meetings or a full day of virtual meetings, or are you an extrovert and find neither taxing?
I'm not that much of an extrovert. I can pretend to be, but I think I'm more of an introvert.
CEO's curse.
Yeah, I'm an undercover introvert. I like in-person meetings. I find in-person meetings less taxing, I think, but mostly because the virtual meetings are much more to the point. Like I like to have my meetings for half an hour because then you're like, okay, we're here to do this thing. Let's get this thing done. And seeing as we're the startup, we're usually the ones that are pushing for an agenda. So you try to get something done within that half hour. Like you're on the spot, you're in the spotlight. Yeah. You need to make sure shit happens. So that's intense. So then you sign off that call. And if you have another one in which you're basically doing the same thing, it's all very high energy. Whereas when you're in person, there tends to be like a bit of a slower pace to it. Which for that reason, I also don't quite like it's good to just, focus on task, especially with clients, because then you're there to reach a certain goal. You're there to deliver, some value. Whereas with in-team meetings, I'm not always all about like, yeah, guys, let's have a very efficient meeting, because it's not always about that. Even though I'm also known to sort of be like, okay, guys, what exactly are we talking about here? And let's get back to the point. But that's not a hard rule when it comes to team dynamics. It's a bit different.
I love the like 15 or 5 minute like Zoom call. Like, hey, what are we doing? Let's do this. Cool. See ya. Type of thing. I'm a huge fan of that, and that's why I love virtual. But if you have like 30-minute increments for 6 hours in a day, that's it's just an observation that I have, and I'm curious if you've seen this too. I think actually sometimes running a less efficient meeting and like spending more time on like the stuff that is actually like functionally irrelevant to the task at hand is the thing that like lubricates the social relationship to ultimately make the agenda like be executed easier. Do you feel like that? So specifically, it'd be like you spend 30 minutes talking about something, 5 minutes talking about the thing that you want, but the 30 minutes is what allows you to get the thing done in 5 minutes. I don't know if you've had that same experience.
I've had that experience in some cases. Yeah. So that you just notice that a potential client, which is currently just a relation, is just happy to talk about like some random stuff. I usually find that this is the case with somewhat older people. That they're just like, oh, let's do this and that. And you're like, oh, interesting. Yeah, I've had this experience. That you sort of go back and forth like that. And then there is like a relationship being built and trust being built. And then it's like, okay, well, we needed to have an agreement on this or that. Can we move forward on this? Okay, yeah, let's pick that up. So yeah, I've seen that happen. At the same time, I've seen those same types of meetings also just derail, being like, all right, this didn't go too well. Yeah, so it can go either way. But in general, like when I have a 30-minute meeting or a 20-minute meeting, like I have an agenda. The way I push that agenda isn't always that doesn't always come apparent in like a highly managed meeting. Sometimes indeed, like just chatting and then getting to the point at the very end can be the point of that agenda. So like, yeah, just because I'm there with a purpose doesn't mean that like a relationship needs to feel rushed.
Yeah.
I think it's the same for like when startups visit events, like in-person events, which I sometimes really don't like. And in some cases they can be effective, but it can also be a huge waste of time. But startups tend to make it not a waste of time because they go there and they're like, okay, these are the people I want to talk to. These are the investors I want to talk to. These are the points I want to make. This is my message during this panel. And then I'm out of there. Whereas a lot of like audience just goes there and sees like, okay, I'm going to go here and let myself be immersed in whatever I'm going to see. But every touch point that they'll have with a startup is very much, according to the agenda of that startup. So I think that's also just the difference between, corporates and startups in meetings and in sort of their take on these in-person events that can be a giant waste of time if you don't make yourself, have some sort of agenda or plan.
Yeah, that's super interesting. How do you stay on task during like a conference or like there's a funnel, like the conference has an incentive to make you do certain things? How do you stay like on point for your specific company's agenda?
I have quite a strong opinion on all the events that we have these days. And one of the things that I'm always highly aware of is that you're the product of the events, as in the events are basically like preying on you. I'm making air quotes for those who listen in Spotify. Are basically preying on you to be there, to spend money, to fill their rooms. So I'm always like hyper aware that they always want to create this feeling of like FOMO, that if you're not there, you're going to miss out on something. And I just think that's a bunch of BS. So I just care about who is there and how efficiently you can speak to people you're looking to meet. And in the case that you have like a strong event strategy within your sales. Like, for example, there are a number of companies who need to have a huge presence in these events because they know that they're well attended by their market and they need to be very eye catching. Then it makes sense and then it's money well spent. But like as soon as you forget that, the event itself wants to make you feel like your time has been usefully spent, that's when you start making mistakes because they want you to feel that way. They want you to feel like you're missing out if you're not actually there. So it's just so important to realize why you're going, what your goal is, because just hanging around at an event like that is pretty pointless, and that's where they get you.
I find it so disruptive to my rhythm. Like you go there, you eat shitty food, drink, and like you don't sleep on time or work out. Like I hate events, and like our fund, it keeps pushing me like you should go to more events, and I'm like, please, I will do it if you think it's a good idea, but I tend to not think so. But I'm always impressed when people go to events and get value. I'm like, how the fuck is that possible?
Yeah, I think I'm there with you. And the experiences I had is like, yeah, if I look critically at what's been achieved and how this time could have been spent better to achieve something very similar, if not more, then it isn't just mostly disruptive. And then you get back and then your email's overflowing and you need to get back into your sleep rhythm. And like nobody likes to work on an airplane. It's like, ugh.
I don't know. I have to think more about it because like certainly a lot of executives spend their time like traveling and going to events and stuff. And I'm like, these people are successful. So there has to be something that I'm not seeing, I don't know. Maybe it's like ultimately, if you can set up the org in a way where the operations are running without your input, then it is actually very leveraged to go and build long-term relationships that you can then hand to like, potential sales team or revenue team to actually work.
Yeah, I feel like it's useful after a certain point in scaling. Like I think you would have to be well within like your series funding rounds before something like this isn't a waste of money and time, or time and money in that particular order, I would say. And once as a CEO, for example, like 10% of the people that you'll be seeing at that event. Like I've been to events because I've been invited as a speaker where I see other people who are just like, oh, here, and there you are. Like, when do we see each other again? They've just been sort of conversing at these types of events for 10 years. And then that's valuable, but it's something that you need to grow into as a person, but also as a company. So I think it's highly dependent on where you are. And as such, as a relatively early stage startup that hasn't reached like Series B, for example, yet, I think it's very easy to get caught up in thinking it's valuable, whereas you're just wasting your time and money. And that doesn't mean that everyone there is wasting their time and money. They're just not you.
So I guess most of your business is done then, I guess, talking to clients remotely, right? You guys are able to generate pipe and all that stuff totally remotely. That's cool. So who are some of your customers?
So we have
not by name. You don't have to name them.
We have they're on their website, but yeah, by archetype, which is more interesting anyway, because you just need to happen to know these businesses, and it's likely that most listeners don't happen to know them. But yeah, so we started out within the new space and Earth observation space. So in that corner, we have a lot of spatial data analytics companies that take in raw spatial data, like a point cloud or a satellite image or a drone image. Or building footprint information, you name it, take all that information, push it through an analytics pipeline, and push out certain information products. That's a good chunk of our user base, and we have good synergy with them because we're a spatial data management solution. So yeah, as you can make it really simple. Like, we all know that a data scientist spends about 80% of their time wrangling data into shape, and then 20% of their time making value. The same goes with spatial data. So if you can help spatial data analytics companies automate their data ingestion, management, and integration process, which is all overhead, so that they can focus their time and money on, or rather time and expertise on creating good analytics, then you have a good, cooperation running there. So there's a bunch in that corner. We also have some government users, and these government users also need to manage spatial data, and their primary use case is exposing spatial data sets to the public. I'll name like the US Geological Survey, who's not a client of ours yet, but it's a good example that most of the listeners will probably know. But where the US has the US Geological Survey, you also have the Ordnance Survey in the UK, who is a client of ours, or PDK within the Netherlands, who is also a client of ours. They're all like, they all own these national data sets that they need to expose to citizens, to universities, to businesses to do their jobs with. And that's also what we're doing, because Ellipsis Drive basically makes it very easy to dump like ridiculously sized files into a data layer and have that properly exposed in a very interoperable way to end users. So it basically unburdens them from all the headache that comes along with, properly exposing data sets to a large audience. So there's government use cases. We also have use cases within the insurance space. Those are also related to the analytics space, because insurance, especially P&C insurance, so property and casualty insurance, needs a lot of data about, for example, climate risk, portfolio exposure, et cetera, et cetera. So they're always interested in like fire hazards, earthquake hazards, climate hazards, like all sorts of things that they need to use for modeling purposes. So there's also a high reliance on spatial data that needs to be managed somehow, and again needs to feed into the processes of data scientists and modelers and underwriters and claims specialists. So that's another one. Then you also have the world of asset management. Like, obviously, when you manage assets that are distributed through space, you also need to manage the data about those. There's some use cases in mobility, some in agriculture. Like, in the end, spatial data is huge, and it touches on a lot of different businesses. Civil engineering is another very important one that's inherently spatial. But yeah, what they all have in common is that they use spatial data either internally or for their clients, and that spatial data requires a spatial data management solution. And it's really as simple as that.
So like, these are several different customer archetypes, and I bet that their needs at the product level are like slightly different, like not so different, but slightly, how do you think about like, what cohort to prioritize, what to go after?
So you're right and wrong in saying like they'll all have like a slightly different need. The biggest one we've noticed is that like bigger enterprises, especially in insurance and real estate and finance, they need to have a solution deployed within their own network for security reasons. So we have now, like if you go to the website and like get registered for an account with Ellipsis Drive to test things out, you'll always end up in a public version in a cloud that we manage. But if you are an end user that prefers to use that system within their own network, we launch a private version on like a single tenant. So that's one of the differences that actually exists. And we've been recently prioritizing making those private deployments easier and easier and easier, because monetization is a lot stronger. Like if you sell someone a private deployment, it's quite easy to ask 6 figures on a yearly basis for that. Whereas if you basically give someone a few hundred gigabytes in storage, like the Dropbox way, the fee for that is usually like 300 to 500 per month. So more like 3K. So like 4 figures a year. So that there's a huge difference there. Of course, the sales cycle for an enterprise deal is also much longer, but we found that at this point in our development, the inflection towards building towards like a multi-million dollar revenue on a yearly basis will definitely be helped by these larger tickets that these enterprise deals bring in. So that's how we've been prioritizing that, and within these enterprise deals, we've been prioritizing insurance and real estate because it is something that is relatively adjacent to the analytics customers that we've been servicing for a long time. So we understand the customer use case, and they're good markets to be focusing on. The way in which you're wrong, though, is aside from that public and private difference, that is stark. So I'll give you that. The way in which you're wrong about like different clients needing different things is that the point of Ellipsis Drive is its interoperability. So the idea is that we, as opposed to a lot of other companies out there, very much anticipate and respect the fact that spatial data users all have different preferences and that we service all of them. Because that's the whole point, being able to say like, hey, I'm this and that persona, and I like to use my spatial data via these endpoints. Then we're like, okay, great. So go ahead, use the endpoint. And your colleague who's a different persona, or your client who's again a different persona, can use the data via the endpoints that make sense for them. So because the interoperability is so baked into the value proposition, we don't have much problem sort of pivoting or servicing very different markets at the same time. It's a different story, though, when you look at a sales funnel and marketing and your messaging, et cetera, because, you're obviously talking to an entirely different, like if you're talking to mobility sector, you're saying different things than when you're talking to insurance or when you're talking to government. But technology wise, under the hood, it is exactly the same. And that's wonderful. That's because it's so baked in, like the interoperability principle. But yeah, I mean, marketing and sales wise, you still need to tell a different story. So it's not to make it sound easy, but there's one benefit.
Yeah, that's awesome. And so, like, do you guys have like a fully fledged sales team right now with different focuses, or more so just focused on the large enterprises, full stop?
So we have like a pretty integrated sales and marketing team. Like in the end, it goes very much hand in hand in my view. Like whenever you reach out to a new market, it will always be multi-channel. Like there'll be cold emailing, there will be touch points, events, there will be LinkedIn, there will be campaigns running, warm intros if we can get them, and all of that sort of exists next to each other. And we found that also very much strengthens each other. If you do all of it at the same time, then people are like faced with this wall of Ellipsis Drive that's coming at them all of a sudden, and you're hard to ignore. And that's 100% a team effort. It's one of the most satisfying things I find is that, the sales and marketing team, that's about 8 people in total, just works well together in, supporting that first brand awareness, then building of the problem, then reaching out and sort of stacking one stone onto another until you get to that initial meeting and you get the client to test. You can, work towards conversion. We have a team that is specialized along those tasks. That can also focus more on the public version of Ellipsis Drive or more on the enterprise version. And there's a certain vertical focus. And then there's a certain like marketing focus and where on the funnel do you sit. But in the end, it's a very interconnected team play. And I find it always very satisfying to see it happening.
Oh, yeah. It's cool to see the team run plays and execute. Yeah, that's super fun. What's the part of the business that like you personally like find the most intellectually gratifying? Is it the sort of rev gen side? Is it the product development side, or just running the whole ship?
It differs honestly from quarter to quarter, I would say, because the way that I see my role is, yeah, I mean, I run the company, but what that means every month is something else. So I focus on whatever is necessary. I focus on the things that tend to not go well. So I feel like I need to understand the problem better, see if we can get like pieces in place. That's like problem solving is what I find most gratifying. And then once the problem is solved, seeing the team pick it up and, really create an oiled machine for something that was previously a problem. I like that a lot. And that can be something, or that is something different every quarter, really. But that's part of like the startup business. Everyone wears a lot of different hats. You problem solve, you fix things in order to scale. And then you look back and go like, well, we did that quite nicely. And then you tackle the next problem. That's of course there right around the corner.
So 10 years ago, maybe 15 years ago, did you anticipate that you'd be like running a tech company?
No, actually 15 years ago, I thought I would work for the United Nations or something like that. I really thought for most of my youth, I thought I would work for government, and then like quite some government in that. And then I realized I'm too young for that, as in you need to be a pretty old soul to survive there. And I'm not yet. So I'll be happy living in the startup world for at least 20, 25 more years.
Yeah, it's funny. I sort of had the same thought. And funny enough, when I used to live in Shanghai, we did a deal with the Indian consulate in Shanghai for some automotive manufacturers that they were bringing into China. And I wanted to also work in government. And I was like, dude, it's boring and it's slow. And I'd rather start a business. And I feel like also if you have business impact, you can actually have more influence in policy than like working your way up the administrative chain, yeah, I think you quickly realize that with like a couple internships.
Yeah, exactly. I think I've had very much the same revelation and experience there. It's, here we are.
All right, Rosalie. Well, where can people find you on the interwebs and find your company?
Ellipsisdrive.com is where you can find the company. But if you type out Ellipsis Drive in Google, you'll find a whole bunch of resources about the company, about me. We're all over socials and are always happy to hear from people, and I'm always happy to dispense advice if someone feels like they can use it. Feel free to reach out and have a look.
Thanks for listening to the Frontier Podcast powered by Gun.io. We drop 2 episodes per week, so if you like this episode, be sure to subscribe on your platform of choice and come hang out with us again next week and bring all your internet friends. If you have questions or recommendations, just shoot us a Twitter DM at The Frontier Pod, and we'll see you next week.